Spike Ops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who infiltrated over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Find us online at spikeops.info. Episode 48, The Questioning of Jim Boyling. Welcome to a recap of week 2 of tranche 3, phase 2 of the undercover police inquiry. This week's evidence was that of the undercover police officer Jim Boyling, who used the cover name Jim Sutton whilst he infiltrated a number of Amorites and saboteur groups, as well as Earth First, reclaiming the streets. He deceived 3 women into intimate sexual relationships, having 2 children with one of them. This week's evidence was broadcast not in its entirety. I'm joined by Ben.
It was one of the better hearings to watch, I think. He was one of those arrogant, angry men who, not remembering lots of things, he was revealing, I think. What he revealed wasn't necessarily true things. For example, one thing that was interesting, here I have Kate Wilson.
Hello.
One thing he thought was interesting was when he talked about an SDS cliche that when the SDS joined a group, they flourished specifically. Most people would agree that's not true. In the case of Reclaim the Streets, when Jason Bishop joins the group, it is in decline and continues to decline with him in it. Nevertheless, it was interesting to hear.
I think it would be helpful to have an idea of where we stand with the restriction orders before we start talking, to know what we can and cannot talk about, but also for the listeners to understand that there's a whole lot of stuff that we're not going to be able to talk about.
Have attempted to make contact with the inquiry on Wednesday afternoon. At the end of the hearings, I was brought in for a special hearing with Mitting, where I was reprimanded for some of the reporting that I did. I was made to delete some of my tweets. However, it turns out that I am not to be blamed, in the words of John Mitting. We are not allowed to talk about anything at all that happened on Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday morning. These are blanket restriction orders. The reporting restriction orders are in place ostensibly to protect the private life of a number of core participants who we cannot name. However, the blanket restriction orders is a time-based one. The things that I was tweeting that I got in trouble for were not restricted information. It just happened in between the timestamps. So if anything was said on Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday morning, we cannot refer to it. There are a number of other shorter time periods where things were said which we're not allowed to report on. So in terms of the restriction order, it's very important for my ability to continue reporting on the inquiry that we do not mention anything that was said on Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday morning. So when we've talked about what happened day by day, we are going to have to stop midday on Tuesday and then pick it up again on midday on Wednesday.
I'm in the same position as a lot of people trying to follow this inquiry from elsewhere because I wasn't in the hearing room. So I didn't hear any of the secret information. There's no danger of me saying something I shouldn't say because I don't know any of it. I've said to other people, this is the most frustrating week so far in the inquiry.
We are joined by Bristol KRS. What was your overall impressions of Jim Boyling?
He's coming across as lovable as you might think from all of the previous reporting. He's not really doing himself many favours by attempting to come across as likeable. He's really going in hard on being as obnoxious as possible.
He has been incredibly obnoxious. He was questioned by David Barr KC, which is like the Premier League of being questioned at the undercover police inquiry. And it started off with Barr expanding on this idea that Jim Boyling said the attraction of living the lifestyle as a full-time Reclaim the Streets activist was an opportunity to be another version of himself. He talks about this existential experiment. Barr would come back to this repeatedly throughout the questioning. We heard at the very beginning, on the morning of the Monday, that he was aware of SDS officers having sexual relationships whilst deployed undercover. It was common knowledge inside Special Branch. It sounds fairly mundane, really, but this is a huge departure from what we've heard from the majority of undercover officers. I think that's quite a big deal.
Towards the end of his witness statement, Jim Boyling is extremely angry. He is extremely angry because he is the only officer who had specifically lost his job for misconduct in public office while he was undercover because of things that he did and relationships that he had. He thinks it is hypocritical and unfair and To a certain extent, it is, because we know that a lot of them did this and we know that a lot of them knew about it. But it's interesting because when actually asked who he talked to about it, he did appear to fall back into only naming officers who were dead or officers who were already discredited.
Well, like Peter Francis.
In his witness statement, he says that he spoke to Andy Coles about the sexual relationship. When that's put to him, he's, I'm not sure. If he says he didn't, then I wouldn't contradict him.
For towing the line on the other side of the thin blue line, when asked about sexism or racism within the force, it was okay to throw the uniformed officers under the bus a little bit, but he was towing the line more in denial than the official line. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police expressed his disgust for the apology expressed by the Commissioner on behaviour to women.
I'll play the clip of what he said about racism.
Were there ever any racist jokes told by anyone within the SDS?
No. SDS wasn't an all-white unit for all the time I was on it either.
Were racial slurs ever used?
No.
Did you ever encounter any racism within the MPS?
I finished university and joined the police, and I went to Brixton in 1986. Brixton would still have had elements of stereotype attitudes, quite endemic at times.
When you say Brixton, do you mean Brixton Police Station?
Yeah, Brixton Division. I was at Brixton.
How endemic was it?
Not the station. There was a good ethnic mix amongst the officers coming in. There was still very old school attitudes there.
That's a euphemism for racist.
Yeah, probably.
And other than Brixton Police Station, did you encounter any other racism in the MPS before joining Special Branch?
I was at Brixton from 86 to 91 and I went straight into Special Branch. It wasn't the same attitudes as you would get on bar.
I'm going to come to Special Branch, but I'm obviously...
I went from Brixton to Special Branch.
But when you were training, any police officers you came into contact with?
But not that I remember.
Outside Brixton?
No.
Special Branch. You joined in July 1991.
Sounds about right.
Did you encounter any racism in Special Branch?
No. Not that I was aware of. I'm a white officer, so it might be different to not in my prison.
How educated were you in things like definitions of racism at that time?
Definitions of racism?
In terms of your ability to spot anything other than very clear racism, what would your capacity have been to detect indirect racism or subtle racism?
I don't think people were aware of those nuances in 1990.
In the circles you were mixed.
Subconscious bias wasn't really a thing in 1990.
That clip's really interesting because, putting the racism thing aside for a minute, you see the ways that he answered the questions. And there were a couple of personas that he had when answering the questions, and none of them rang, I don't quite know how to put it, where he would just say no to things before even letting Barr finish the question, which is how he started answering. And then there's this thoughtful, I'm considering this persona that he puts on. And you can see in that clip, he starts off by doing his dismissive, no, I object to this line of questioning. And then does a bit of a backtrack and goes, oh, hang on a minute, it's going to look really bad if I act like I don't care about racism. And then starts giving these sort of really theatrically considered answers to the question. Essentially, that's what his evidence was. He was either dismissively angry about the answers, or he was doing this very contrived, I'm being thoughtful and trying to be helpful with my answers. Both of were incredibly, it's irritating.
Modern standards. It might be considered racist by modern standards. No, it was considered racist back in 1986 by the people of Brixton. Any right-thinking person by that point knew what police racism looked like and felt like, and was against.
1981, when the people of Brixton kicked off against the police, it was very clear.
In the 70s, it was very clear. I think these cops think that they inhabit some different timeline to the normal society because their attitudes are out of date.
Right from the start of the inquiry, officers going back to the 60s, going, oh, it was a different time. But Diane Langford stewarded that straight away when she was being questioned about it. And she name-checked the people like James Baldwin, who were all public discourse at the time, were criticising this racism for what it was way back then. Going back through in chronological order, Boyling claimed that he read the files when he was in the back office before he was deployed. Both Chitty and John Vines's file were very well documented on the sexual relationships they had, and we haven't seen these documents. the inquiry. When he was first deployed, he had a fake girlfriend in Copenhagen. He said, because Lambert had advised him, Bob Lambert, the former undercover officer who was now head of the unit, that was manager, was it'll help you avoid having sex whilst deployed undercover. This didn't last long. When we see his first reports, he's infiltrating the East London animal rights. He claims this is part of his attempt to get access to a Huntsab group, which is an insane way of getting access to a Huntsab group, completely opposite of what other undercover officers said about infiltrating animal rights and getting into Huntsabs. It's normally you go to a Huntsab group to infiltrate the animal rights group. You go to the animal rights group to infiltrate the Hunts. Make that make sense. There's a lot to unpack with Operation Gant.
There's a couple of documents mentioning Operation Gant. One of them is an SDS annual report from 95 or 96, 97. The other is a 2013 witness statement from Jeff Lurie in SO13. And he describes, while talking about Operation Sparkler, investigating the Debenhams bombing and Bob Lambert's involvement, he says that Operation Gant was a separate operation running in parallel at the same time.
So back in the
So we're
mid-1980s.
talking 87 or earlier, involving a series of 50 incendiary device attacks, mostly on butchers in East London. I have searched animal rights publications, media, communiques, etc., from that period, including local media in East London, and have found nothing that remotely resembles that. You'll find butchers' windows getting smashed and daubed with paint and meat is murder or whatever. But 50 incendiary device attacks, that would be news. I can't find anything about it at all. So it's a series of attacks, an operation, an investigation, 10 years before it's used as the pretext for Jim Boyling's deployment. Then becomes something to do with Essex hunters.
Because that's who he's in for.
Then got to another section of the hearings which were suspended from broadcast. There was a temporary restriction order in place that related to Ben. That's been lifted. Right. It was all a bit complicated. It relates to the Good Easter case. There's been a short video made which hopefully covers that.
There was a restriction order linking my name to Gant. I didn't actually want it. I asked them to not have it. They said it was too late. I managed to get rid of it by the mid-morning break.
He was present where a number of Huntsabs were arrested. Essex hunt was a particularly nasty, violent hunt where you could basically expect to be arrested before midday. And that's exactly what happened.
Were you given any parameters before that event as to how you could behave?
No.
Was your handler nearby?
No.
Any handler nearby? But were you given any assurance you wouldn't be arrested?
Boyling was there and they didn't show the video. It's very interesting watching Boyling's actions because actually there's a number of arrests. I think 4 people were arrested in a car park and Boyling was not arrested. But interestingly, he's actually the only person in the videos who fights the cops. He does it more than once.
Yes.
And everyone else is just standing around. And every time they pull their buttons and they rip his clothes and they beat him out the way and then they arrest someone else.
I thought one of the questions he was asked was whether he'd had any particular briefing before that Good Easter hunt of what he was allowed to do. Because as you say, acts like really...
And he acts like Mark Kennedy.
Yeah, exactly. It got me thinking, is it a case of the fact that these undercover officers are presented with the reality of what it's like dealing with cops? And they go, the fuck, this is fucking insane. Fuck off. Can't fucking be able to.
Yeah.
And then it react in like a normal human reaction, which us as activists have learned to suppress because
because we know that there's a long list of resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer.
Yeah, because they're undercover cops, they get away with it. But in those moments, they're like, it's just this normal human reaction.
Outrageous.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
The suggestion of why he didn't get arrested for that is the fact that the unit is not quite as secret as they make out it is.
Yeah. See, in one of these videos, there's a piece of paper on the dashboard reflected in the windshield that has the number plates of the vans, the Huntsabs being arrested, which means that they obviously had some prior intelligence, the uniform cops who were there that day, who was expected to be there and may well have gone in with plans to... There's a lot of questions that remain. There's a lot of questions that weren't asked. What was interesting in the evidence today is he walks away from that day, but he did offer to be a witness for the defence. And he was there at the courthouse on the day. He was actually there, prepared to take the witness stand if necessary. And there is a written statement that was drafted. It's not signed. And quite interestingly, at the beginning of his evidence, he basically accuses Bindman quite serious misconduct.
Mike Schwartz.
This is a draft, unsigned witness statement about the incident. Is it right that you must have had a conversation with Mr. Schwartz, provided a witness statement and been sent a draft?
No, I wasn't even aware there was a statement till it was on Newsnight about 10 years ago that I was supposed to have given this statement, and I haven't read it.
Were you aware Mr. Sutton was an undercover police officer?
I'm not prepared to enter into that.
You say 6 cases a year. That's 15 years ago. Who knows? There could be dozens and dozens of similar cases involving undercover police officers.
Was there ever any discussion about whether your identity as a UCO should be disclosed to either the criminal or the civil courts?
No,
Or the prosecutors or the civil defence team?
I think so.
Did your managers know you were going to support the defendants at the criminal trial?
Yeah, I would have told them.
And did they say anything about
The advice
protecting you?
Oh, no.
We've seen the draft witness statement, and I understand your evidence is didn't recall writing it
My evidence says I didn't write it.
or provide the instructions from which it was written.
I was asked if I would be willing to give a statement. I said yes, but the statement you've got, I didn't write and it wasn't written in my presence.
Were you given any instructions about what account you should give if you were ever asked to provide a witness statement?
The advice would be to avoid giving one. You can, and I did manage to avoid having to give one.
I'm exploring whether there was any discussion that you should give an account that wouldn't be helpful to the defense.
What's interesting is we had one of those fairly rare things, an interjection from John Mitting himself, asking a question about this very topic. And I wasn't left with any doubt that John Mitting believes that Mike Schwartz didn't falsify the witness statement.
Boyling said, my own solicitors have said that this is very unlikely.
Yeah.
This is my belief about this. And he did eventually withdraw that belief, say maybe he did give an account over
But he
the
doesn't
phone,
remember.
But he's just forgotten it.
My recollection is at odds with a very large firm of lawyers. Perhaps my recollection is incorrect.
There was a reason for doubting the normal practice of their firm that was followed in preparing a witness statement. Then I wanted to hear from you.
Okay, I will bow to the recollection.
There's a question there where Barr says, what I want to know is, was there any advice about writing a statement that wouldn't help the defense? The idea that perhaps you offer a statement, but it's useless, and any defense team worth their salt wouldn't actually use it, and therefore you've been seen to be helpful, but at the end of the day, they're not going to call you. And he wasn't called. There is, however, that statement was given to Keir Starmer, the barrister who would have been defending in court that day. I've done a bit of an analysis of this on Twitter, but one of the key features of his statement is when he repeats the police line in their arresting officer statements, where he says there were children in the car park who came over to see what all the fuss was about. Seems like a fairly innocent thing, except this is a public order section 4 and 5 offences, which require there to be people, members of the public in the vicinity, to feel threatened by the behaviour. So he makes the police case in his defence statement.
There is extensive video of this event and there are no children in it. The only people who mention these children are the police witnesses, the uniformed officers giving evidence for the prosecution, or the witness statement from the other officer that was given to the defence. So that mention of the children in the car park who did not exist is quite significant.
And the only people we can see in the car park are hunt sabs or police officers. There's no other members.
Which makes it not a Section 4 or 5 public order offence.
In court, it was the police video that undermined their case. The police arresting officer statements were written together. You can see in their police notebooks, they were all written at exactly the same time, 7 hours after the event. And then their witness statements all contain made-up dialogue of people saying, oh, I love the smell of cooking pig.
The vegan says.
So it was actually really easy. I thought we got off because justice. But now I'm thinking,
You sweet summer child.
Now I'm.
Who is the defense barrister? Policy.
I defended myself, and I got off 24 hours before those represented by Keir Starmer, which I thought was quite a impressive feat. But in hindsight, it might have had something to do with the prosecution worried about the involvement of an undercover cop, and they just wanted it out of the way.
Around the same time, Boyling's report that he submitted on the 3rd of December 1995, a topic that he returned to many times, an incident, a reoccurring incident in his life of a huntsman being pulled off his horse, sometimes remixed to be a police officer pulled off his horse.
Exactly.
Here's a little video about that.
Report dated the 3rd of December 1995 about a Hunt Saboteur Association meeting, the Essex Regional Meeting. Could we have the third paragraph down, please? Give you a moment to refresh your memory, but it's the passage about a huntsman being pulled from his horse and the person believed to be responsible that I'm interested in.
Okay.
Were you an eyewitness to the huntsman being pulled off his horse?
I don't remember this.
Did anybody...
Possibly I was present at a lot of SABs, but
it says believed to be.
if I'd seen the attack, I might have been present at the event, but not seen this incident is what I meant.
Did anyone tell you they had witnessed me doing that?
I don't remember.
Another fine bit of police evidence there. This was something he came back to a couple of times. He claims to have seen police officers pulled off horses, other huntsmen pulled off. He was quite dismissive that time, but later on he was like, oh yes, many times. This was, couldn't tell you where because it's such a common event.
I think this needs somebody to go and investigate and ask police forces, have you ever had police officers pulled off horses, and get some statistics?
Yeah.
Because I do not believe it happens as often as claimed.
Never seen anybody.
It's hard to do because horses are big.
Yeah.
And they have food.
I've seen hunters come off horses,
Yes.
pull them off the horse.
There's quite famous cases where police officers have fallen off horses, sometimes in riot situations where the horse is bucked and run off down the street. And the police officers have then sued the police for injury compensation afterwards. So I'm sure there are figures available of those incidents, but I haven't come across a single situation where protesters have pulled off
Another
horses.
information request in the making. Yeah.
Including somebody used to ask David in Somerset because he claimed this happened in Bristol Street Party as well, didn't he?
I was there and recall being in court as someone was accused in relation to the female mounted officer. He initially conflates it with a male officer, but it was 100% a female officer. We recognised her at many events after that. There was also a variation at Bristol, syringes used as darts, where the claim was that after the horses were returned to the stables, one of the officers there noticed that there was a syringe stuck in the saddle, indicative of someone having thrown a hypodermic syringe aiming at the horse to try and injure the horse. Not quite sure why someone would be throwing syringes at horses or what the possible effect of that might be. The person that was accused of the incident with the mounted officer, they weren't convicted or anything, was put before the court and nothing came of it. He was there. He put some little juicy bits of detail into his statement, but there was no clear-cut, a protester pulled an officer off of a horse. It was slightly chaotic scenes, but yeah, not as he described it.
Lots of times when he seems to be referring to things that he had read in the paper after an event.
It was in the Bristol Evening Post. They had full coverage weeks beforehand and weeks afterwards. It was a very big local news event. He wouldn't have had to have got the story up of someone else. He could have literally just read it in the Bristol Evening Post.
So many things that he said under oath during the hearing or in his witness statement, he's supposed to be truthful in it, where he's had to roll back or it's become so obvious that it's just made up. For example, even in his original deployment, he claimed that he found all these ALF people and then had to admit that actually in all the time he was deployed and undercover and hanging out with these people, he never knew of any instance of them doing any sort of ALF type behaviour. But he knew they must be ALF because he'd read it in a file. When then he was asked about the attacks, he claimed he was there to report, or he had to admit that during his entire deployment, there wasn't a single case of anything like that ever happening.
This is a recurring theme with the spy cops giving evidence. There are serious allegations made in the reports, and it's quite rare. Most of them are utter drivel or deeply personal information. But ever so occasionally, the inquiry comes across allegations that people are involved in planning violence against other people or involved in incendiary device attacks or damage to property. Part of the terms of reference of the inquiry is to go into those potential justifications for the undercover policing. So they do ask a lot of questions about these incidents where there's an allegation. And I have yet to hear an undercover officer come back with specifics about an actual crime. It was James Thompson when he's talking about people plotting revenge attacks against the driver of the vehicle that ran over a hunt sab. He can't give a single detail. Bob Lambert, when he was asked about some of the ALF stuff that he alleges in his reporting or in his witness statement, it's all vague, and it's vague because they know that as soon as they start to give details, people can disprove it. There have been instances where there have been specifics in allegations, either dates or locations, or just enough information to enable you to go and find the reporting from the time about the crime. And invariably, that has led to people being able to say, yeah, no, I definitely wasn't there. Look, I can show you I was somewhere else.
The only stories we've heard of violence that to me do sound credible and do sound like they really did happen were the stories of there were some Hunt supporters that brandished shotguns at the Hunt Sabs. There was a drunken Hunt supporter that drove a vehicle deliberately towards the Hunt Sabs, like to knock them down. I have no doubt at all that those incidents happened.
And yet, in his witness statement, I hope, there's the reference to the high quality or first class intelligence relating to violent Hunt Sabs in Essex. There's no reporting that kind of correlates with that claim at all. In fact, there's reports referring to the violence melded out by the Hunt supporters. I think his deployment is unique in that he starts his deployment with a fantasy arson attack plot rather than uses it to prolong his operation towards the end, which is a pattern we have seen played out. What we've never seen is right at the beginning of an operation, this really big thing, major criminal accusation, and then it just fizzled out. It completely disappears. And he gone to being deployed to police sandpits in a street. It's very bizarre.
I think the key to that oddity is Bob Lambert. Bob Lambert was Jim Boyling's mentor. Jim Boyling was deployed into East London Animal Rights, the organisation that Jackie was involved with. It was the organisation that Lambert had spied on in the 1980s. He sends Boyling in there on the basis that he is supposed to be investigating this operation, which has also been going on since the 1980s. As far as we know, there were no arrests ever made under the auspices of Operation Gant. Once Boyling is in there and claiming to genuinely be finding intelligence about these animal rights extremists, he's pulled out and he's sent to spy on Reclaim the Streets, who at the time did some very large demonstrations later on. But actually, Boyling was involved in the organisation of all of those demonstrations. At the point where he is deployed into Reclaim the Streets, they had done two very nice street parties, one in Camden, one in Islington. There is this kind of sense in the undercover officers' approach to this. I think we'll see more of it on Monday, tomorrow, when Jason Bishop gives evidence, that the major public disorder seen later on in the 1990s totally justified these deployments. What they're ignoring is the chronology, that actually Boyling was deployed out of the ALF into Reclaim the Streets, which at the time was a relatively small, although quite exciting, environmental direct action group. And once he's in there, he starts getting involved in organising what do become major public order events. There was the March for Social Justice in 1997. There was in 1990.
Just before we move on to this, he didn't infiltrate the ALF. He infiltrated an animal rights group, reclaimed members of which were the ALF.
and claims very good things. He went to 2 public meetings of his group. They all come up to him afterward over tea and biscuits.
He claims the way that he was able to infiltrate the streets is that he saw somebody on a Hansab who he recognized from the photographs of her clearing the streets to know that they had attended a clearing the streets. And he therefore spent the day getting in conversation with them until that person invited him to an RTS meeting. And that was the way that he was able to get into the public meetings that were very publicly announced by Reclaiming Streets every year.
We know that Boyling ran stalls for the Hansab group. Once he'd got into this secret group, he ran stalls which recruited members of the public from the street to join the Hansab group. And that is how most people will have got involved in Hansab groups, is through the stalls that they ran, where they would invite people to come along with them. It's nonsense. And you have to wonder whether their intelligence was so bad that they believed this themselves.
No, it contradicts the traditional path of using Hansabs to get to the ALF. Described again and again that the Hunt Saboteurs is a gateway to the ALF. He does it the opposite way.
I was thinking more about that Reclaim the Streets was a closed group.
Yes.
In the 22nd December 95 report, which is the first Boyling report on Reclaim the Streets, he said that the reason why supposedly this pivot happens is that he reports they were planning systemic attempts to cause serious traffic obstruction in a given area. So worth dropping the bombing campaign, animal rights extremism, there was going to be some serious traffic obstruction in a given area, and Jim Boyling was on the case. As is the case with David Barr, anytime he started the topic of Reclaim the Streets, and then very quickly pivoted to the fact Jim Boyling is a married man. All undercover officers had to be married men to be brought into the SDS. His wife had left him, and he only told his bosses in the August of 96. His wife had left him in the January of 96. He asked him why he left it so long, to which Boyling uttered the immortal words, "Is this really relevant?" Yes, Jim, we're going to be talking about your personal life. How very unpleasant for you for your personal life to be violated in this way. He was very unhappy about being asked this question. He was asked if his undercover deployment was the reason for the marriage falling apart. He said you'd have to ask her, and he blames her for the end of the marriage. He said he didn't tell his bosses that she'd left him 7 months earlier because he didn't want to give a winning commentary on his private life.
There they look into his private life is because shortly after his wife leaves him is when he starts deceiving the women that he's spying on into sexual relationships. Chronology is not necessary causation, but it's fairly damning circumstantial evidence.
And that response gets used a lot. Well, you have to ask her, you have to ask Bob Lamb, you have to ask the office, you have to ask the activists. So ask anyone, just don't ask me. While we're still on day one thing I did want to mention was that he talked about how he joined this online Manzi network, and then he was asking questions about the misuse of computers. And he claimed that it was the very early days of the internet. Now, I know that I'm not the only person here who was online years before this and using the internet as far back as 1992 and in the 80s and 70s and so on. Jim Boyling had a law degree. Amazing.
So he should have known the law about this.
Yeah, but basically he was claiming that computers were in the infancy in 1995, which is just not true.
He talked about it as if it was some sort of wizardry that other people wouldn't understand.
But Andy Cole, you've been using computers earlier as well.
Big issues with the acceleration of the Animal Rights National Index in 1986 was bringing Colin Wiggins in with his paper records from Essex and computerizing it. There was a round robin sent to corporations in 1986. The fact that Special Branch had computerized all of their own records in relation to animal rights groups and activists at that time. So this is 10 years prior to Jim Boyling being deployed undercover. SDS would have been fully aware of this level of importance of computer records because they were feeding their own reports into the Army computerized system through their own information routes. The notion that this was all some amazing new technology that had come out of nowhere and he had no expectations of what the rules and regulations around information flow just beggars belief, really.
And it's something we're going to see a lot more of as we go forward, is their misuse of the internet. And ironically, there's the rules around interfering with people's communications, telephones, computers, even post are a lot tighter than the rules around infiltration and undercover policing.
Messages forwarded.
Marks was passing people's emails straight to his handler. The law around this stuff is a lot clearer. So hopefully it's going to be easy to pin some of these officers down around the misconduct.
The stuff around the Royal Mail is really old law, and even Boyling won't be able to pretend that was some newfangled thing that
So we've just got to the afternoon of Monday, and this is where the questioning of Reclaim the Streets got underway. He started off talking about the M41, Reclaim the Streets of July 96, about how he wasn't in the core group, but he was a driver of one of the sound system trucks. He said that by not provoking the police, he said they were going to avoid violence by not provoking police, which I think says about where the actual violence came from.
Leaky bastards.
So according to his report, it said that as Reclaim the Streets parties tail off, crusties may become confrontational. And Jim Boyling was appalled. This couldn't be his report. He wouldn't possibly ever say anything as dehumanizing as crusty. He went into a big thing about how none of these reports were written by him. He knows that because he never wrote things down. Apart from when we get to June the 18th, where he did write some stuff down. But for the most part, all his reporting was done orally. He would speak to his handler and the handler would write them up. So therefore, he can't be held responsible for anything that's in the report because he's not the person who did the typing. This was a theme that actually we've heard from so many of the undercover officers. Talked about the stolen materials we used on the M41 protest. He says he knows they were stolen because he stole some of it. No one was arrested for that. Nothing was returned. And it wasn't his job to report theft that he took part in. He said that he witnessed missiles being thrown at the police and after confrontation at the end of the M41 street party. He talked about elements from the likes of class war coming to piggyback RTSs to have a confrontation with the cops. And then we got to his relationship with Monica, who was the first woman who he deceived into an intimate relationship. We heard from her, we've recapped it already. She gave evidence the week before, was questioned about the relationship he had with her. It's very clear that she was an activist. Reclaim the Streets, we see her being mentioned in her reports. He tries to distance himself from that. As they said, she was a bit of an activist, very much on the fringes. We were shown an action of August 96 against Transport for London in solidarity action with the underground workers who were on strike. We saw he got arrested at that, and there was a question about that. He said that managers thought that SDS officers getting arrested for public order offences was a good thing, providing they weren't charged. And we saw his report, which had a scribble on it by a docker saying, "Seen and enjoyed, well done, Jim." There's still a sense that because there was no charges brought, that it was quite a positive thing for officers to get themselves arrested.
Didn't he go to court?
He did, absolutely. There was a belief that there would be no charges brought. Everybody was very happy about this. But as it turns out, yes, he does end up in court. He breaches legal professional privilege, passing on this information to his managers of the meeting between the solicitor and the clients. He claims to remember none of this. It was in January 97. He gave evidence as a defendant. No consideration about misleading the court. He tried to play down the legal advice that he received from Mike Schwartz. He claims that his report was truthful, as if the fact that he was pretending to be somebody else, acting as an undercover officer, wasn't really matter because he was truthful and everyone was acquitted anyway. It was put to him that Edmondson had no qualms about one of his undercover officers appearing in court in a false identity. Jim Boyling was in complete agreement. There were no concerns about that taking place. He said it wasn't unusual for an undercover officer to be arrested and to appear in court. He knows of no case where the court was informed about the status of the undercover officer. We then looked at reports about a street party in Brighton, August 96. Boyling says he wasn't involved in the planning, but went down a few days before to help out with other RTS activists from London. As it turns out, police in Brighton decide to go with a Roman confrontation. Doesn't go that well. Lots of police charging the crowd. He refers to it as a running battle, people throwing missiles at police. So the report claims that there was very little damage to property, despite the fact that Boyling witnessed criminal damage to property on the running battle. We were then shown a copy of the Osmantius Sabotage Skills Manual, which the inquiry didn't want anybody to see.
It's on archive.org.
This was treated as if it was some sort of bomb-making manual. We saw some reports about Reclaim the Future in Liverpool from September 96, where he learned of a plan to shut the railway into the docks with scaffolding. He was involved in cutting the fences to get onto the dock site. He talked about how very aggressive the local police were towards the dockers and the RTS activists. This was the connection between the Liverpool dockers who were on strike at the time and the RTS activists. I think it's a really important bit of our history. Just as a quick aside, was really nice to find out more about. Obviously, we're getting now to the era of things that I lived through. He signed off by Reclaim the Streets as a name of the group, was named after the Russian revolutionary adage to seize power. I have checked with historians of the Russian Revolution and people involved in Reclaim the Streets. Nobody has ever heard this before. So Jim Boyling has some special little insight into the Russian Revolution and some adage that nobody else knows, or he's talking absolute bullshit.
He's talking absolute bullshit.
He's talking
bullshit.
Although around when Reclaim the Streets first started.
No, they were involved in the Russian Revolution.
Did it come from the conflict lyric? Fans of a narco punk might know the refrain from A Governable Force album is reclaim the streets, reclaim the towns, reclaim the nation. Came out in 1984. I assumed that the anarchist reference was the reason for it being the name of the group. Apparently, they'd never heard of that.
The Reclaim the Street Action Network were not conflict fans. I can say that with confidence.
Outrageous. How could anybody not be a conflict fan?
It was on London Street Party flyer. There is a phrase at the top, but it's not the phrase that Boyling suggested, which is in order to take power, you have to first reclaim the street.
Yes.
Control the city.
Yeah, it's a similar phrase, and it may be where he's getting that idea from. And I don't believe it comes from the Russian Revolution either. Linking it to the Russian Revolution is interesting because throughout tranches 1 and 2, we heard a lot about this idea of subversion. You have to remember that the STS and a lot of the work that Special Branch was doing is coming out of the Cold War and the capitalist obsession with making sure that Britain doesn't become a communist country. And whilst it just sounds ridiculous to most of us, actually, there is a significance to trying to link Reclaim the Street to Russian revolutionary ideas, because that is one of the things that could legitimize the work that the SDS were doing. Come the late 1990s, the Cold War has ended and that remit to spy on potential subversives is more or less gone.
Yeah. Boyling said the SDS didn't care if a group was subversive or not. They were interested in public order. And at the time, RTS was the number one public order priority for Special Branch. They were embarrassed that we'd had these street parties that involved thousands of people and the police were taken totally by surprise.
I think in that,
They really didn't like that either. But it was just a sound system in a big vehicle. It wasn't a militarised tank with guns or anything.
when you look back to the Grosvenor Square incident that led to the SDS being set up in 1968, it was that experience of something happening on a demonstration that they had been completely unprepared for. And I think that to an extent, they were unprepared for reclaiming the streets and the tactics and the creativity and the energy that those parties had from the perspective of a unit that is set up for political and social control. That sense of, oh God, something's happening and we're not in on it, probably did make it a priority. But it does say a lot, I think, about their priorities, that they were supposedly investigating serious crime and they decided that traffic obstruction was a greater priority for them.
This pivoted straight into looking at reports about the action of April 97. The report claiming the streets were not actually interested in social justice. They just wanted to take on the police. So it said, yes, absolutely, that was the case.
That came out that I was particularly interested in was the social justice, public order stuff.
There's a meeting with the Special Branch Environment Desk person and your two sergeants and TN19 on the 13th of March. Most of the meeting taken up with discussion about the forthcoming RTS extravaganza involving the DOE building scheduled for the 12th of April.
Yes, we planned, because I was one of the organisers, to take control of the vacant Department of the Environment building and occupying the building and then holding it in the run-up to the general election.
He kept using we and us, and that was disturbing because he's a co-organizer. So he's using we when talking about Reclaim the Street instead of they. It's fucked up.
TN19 agreed wholeheartedly that no action should be taken on the basis of HN14's information.
One of the issues around organising any action is that the plan can be very fluid up until the last moment, and reporting can appear inaccurate by virtue of being given too early.
He kept going on, the plans change, it's in flux, direction's always in flux. And maybe we didn't want to tell Uniform because the plans would change.
There's certainly some sort of
Perfect.
contempt towards uniforming from special branch. The idea that we wouldn't want to bother their little heads about anything complicated because we don't want to tell them twice.
Did the decision to withhold the change?
Yes, because they were fully aware, because I was told on the phone that the decision that activists would not be allowed to occupy the Department of the Environment building had been made by the Home Secretary.
So what it turns out, he says, at one point in March of Justice, he gets a phone call from SDS saying that the Home Secretary has decided, and it's not okay for an anarchist group to occupy, even though it's an empty government building, in the lead up to general election in Westminster.
I think it might have been Keith Edmondson. I think it was a phone call when I was driving my van. I remember pulling over to take the call and thinking that's going to be really difficult. And I was told that no, the Home Secretary had decided that the negative publicity in the run-up to an election caused by anarchists seizing a government building next to Parliament Square would be too damaging and it's not to go ahead. I think our policing line was that it's a vacant building, that we were less concerned.
Presumably, you're not able to shed any light on when the Home Secretary took that decision, are you?
It was very late. I remember it was too late for me to try to see if there was any chance of tweaking the plan.
Was that suggested to you?
We went to give a full briefing on what the organisers' intentions are so that the event can be policed effectively. From the special branch point of view, it shows that we've got good coverage. If the activists come up with a plan that we can tweak towards something acceptable, everyone's a winner. The disaster scenario for us is where the activists have one plan and it's blocked, because then we've got no idea what they're going to do. Then you do get running battles and you don't know what's going to happen. We would have been happy to give them the empty building. It's not helpful to us to be told that, no, that's not going to happen.
So he says that's what stopped us. That's what made the decision. But it doesn't talk about that whole discussion, which was really interesting, which is all about, should we let them do it or should we not let them do it?
When he was asked about the disorder that happened in Trafalgar Square, he very quickly started talking about what was in the tabloid newspapers the next day. And I had to be reminded by Barr that he was being asked questions as an eyewitness, not someone who read the tabloids the next day.
Yeah.
And then he just was desperately thrashing around, trying to think of things that were disorderous that he witnessed himself. And he didn't have a great deal.
And then he said that these events are badly policed.
One of the things which did come out was that CO11 did not trust the intelligence that was coming from SO12, from the SDS, so much that they felt the need to look into setting up their own unit. We saw like a letter from the commander of CO11 to SO12 thanking them for information. But Boyling said that they never wanted the uniformed police to ever know who the undercover officer was because they didn't trust them not to reveal that undercover officer. We just had a question from Maddox Roberts, one of the filmmakers who made The Police Spies Who Ruined Our Lives. How common are instances of the Home Secretary being involved in real time like this? Certainly, it's the first example that I think we've been made aware of during the inquiry of a real-time interjection by a Home Secretary.
My understanding is that all of the Home Office's own records about their interactions with the SDS have been destroyed. So we're relying on these glimpses that we get. The Home Office have not been called to give evidence yet, and the inquiry doesn't appear to intend to ask the Home Office to give a corporate statement about how involved they were in this stuff. But we do see a number of instances. 1997, we're talking, I think, about Michael Howard having intervened and said this is not to be allowed to go ahead. We later see in Boyling's evidence in 1998 around the Birmingham G8 that he is specifically congratulated by Jack Straw for the work that he's done.
Although he denied that testimony.
We see it later as well with other G8 summits in 2005. One of those events, a bit like June the 18th, all the spy cops who were deployed were involved in. Mark Kennedy has publicly said that his briefings were going across Tony Blair's desk. It's written down in a lot of the authorizations later on that a good part of the purpose of this political policing was to avoid embarrassment for Her Majesty's government. And they're protecting events like we'll come to next week, Arms Fair. It's a big international arms fair, takes place in London, and they're policing that because they don't want to damage Britain's reputation in the international arms trade. They don't want to embarrass the government at these big international events. So they're cracking down on protest for that reason. I think there's going to be an increase in government involvement and briefings going to government to inform what they're saying about stuff.
Some observers have suggested that maybe it would be time for the inquiry to ask questions of some of those people who served as Home Office ministers. So Mark Howard is still alive. He sits in the House of Lords. He's compos mentis. He could be sent a civilian witness statement request. Jack Straw, similarly, still alive, could be asked questions. If this inquiry was really keen to get to the truth, they could find out a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. What we see in this particular case appears to be SDS reporting getting past jumping the normal Met police straight up to a higher level, skipping the police at all. And yet Jim Boyling will say, all we want to do is create the best possible, fullest briefing so that, they can be effective policing. Almost in the same breath as having said, we didn't tell the police.
Another interesting thing that he said there that we need to be aware of when we're listening to these officers is the suggestion that had he had time, he would have tweaked the plan.
Whoa.
This is where you see that these undercover officers, they're going into political groups and they're not just observing and reporting back on what people are doing. They are manipulating. And that idea that he would have, in the police's interest, in special branches' interest, he would have gone in and he would have tweaked the plan and made sure that there was a suitable plan B that would have come out with everyone's a winner and everyone's managed to achieve what they wanted to achieve. That is very deep state political interference in people's rights to organise and people's rights to protest, where you've essentially got a police officer saying, had I had time, I would have gone back into the meetings and I would have organised a new plan for people to protest. And I think we need to be really aware of that. That's what they were doing.
DO11 didn't trust the intelligence they were getting from the SDS. They went on to start their own unit, the Forward Intelligence Teams. As an activist, when we found out about the existence of spy cops, I always assumed that all these sections of the police were working together. As it turns out, they're not contempt for each other. They were engaged in a form of turf war inside the police. When you consider that by this point, the only real client of SDS intelligence is the public order branch. Public order branch don't trust them enough that they sent their own unit to go and harass protesters. If anybody remembers the times the Forward Intelligence Teams and just being stalked, essentially, it was significant deployments, really stressful things to deal with. I had a lot of problems with Forward Intelligence Teams. But that was simply because the SDS were not trusted by other forms of the police, which I find quite wild. But I pivoted this talk of the March for Social Justice into something which happened that very same day, the start of deceptive sexual relationship with Monica. We went through the details of how they met, how they kissed, how they went back to his flat, the beginning of the sexual situation. He claimed that young men don't run away from nice women kissing them. It was all very gross. He started talking bullshit about how he invested too much of himself in his role as an undercover officer. He would point out to him that he was going to SDS meetings at least twice a week. He said, oh no, because it was a time of a lot of big actions, he was going to SDS meetings every single day. So the idea that he'd lost himself in his undercover identity is somewhat unconvincing. He said that he didn't think about deceiving Monica because his whole life was a deceit. He said that his hypothetical girlfriend in Denmark was no longer plausible. It was put to him by Barr that he was offered sex and he was going to take it. He denied this, but then had to admit it was, yes, for sex and full cover. He claimed he tried to downplay the length of the relationship with Monica. It was put to him that Monica would not have consented to sex with him if she had known he was undercover officer. He denied this. He said she might have. He was asked if he gave any thought to consent at any time. He said he couldn't remember. He stopped himself and said simply, no, if she says that, I won't dispute. For me, that just looked like coaching. The way that he instinctively had a whole fucking spiel he wanted to come out with. And then in his brain, something went, no, remember we were told, don't go down that particular road. I don't dispute what she says. It is a line we've heard from so many undercover officers when it comes to allegations that puts them by women they deceived into sex. Yet the final line of the day from David Barr was, what would it have taken to stop you? To which he squirmed uncontrollably. And then Barr was like, would a strong management line have helped? To which he went, I think so. And that was the end of the hearing for the day.
Into a sexual relationship. It's a big deal, isn't it?
Yes.
Did you, with Ruth, have thought to the fact that you were deceiving her as to your real identity?
No.
Did you give any thought that you were depriving her of the opportunity to make an informed decision to consent to sex.
No,
You should have done, shouldn't
that would have been a better idea, but I don't see how that could have come about.
could have come about by giving consideration to her as a human being. And
I gave great consideration to her.
how can you say that when you deprived her of consent?
I don't think I had.
If it was said that your answers display a disregard for her as a woman, what would you say?
I have the highest regard for her, but the last thing I would have wanted would have been disrespectful to her.
But that is precisely what you were by depriving consent, isn't it?
To an extent, but that was a product of the circumstances.
God, he's fucking horrible. That was never Mr. Ruth he deceived, but I think it illustrates how particularly gross he is when talking about this.
The man believes that he did nothing wrong.
What we can talk about is what he said that day about Monica. He kept repeating this thing about the majority of the spy corps who infiltrated these lifestyle movements had sexual relationships. And then he went on to say, it was 90% lifestyle and 10% politics. And then repeated this thing, which I'm sure he said several times. There's no way a single man would ever have been accepted in these groups. Looking around who was actually in RTS meetings and in the RTS group, there were plenty of single people. And there's a load of people now that have said, do I need to write a petition or come forward with the inquiry to prove that I was single and never had relationships with activists the entire time I was in this group? Because that's what Jim's relying on here, is saying I had to do this. It was part of keeping my cover. We've heard that before from other spy corps.
Later on, after he's been taken through all of the awful, deceitful, abusive things that he did in the sexual relationships that he deceived women into, he's asked whether he would adhere to the apology that the Metropolitan Police have issued. And his reaction was fury.
I'm going to read to you the Metropolitan Police Service's apology produced to this inquiry at the start of tranche 2. And the question, once I've read it, is whether you align yourself with that apology. Now, these relationships, and it's referring to the sexual relation, were a gross violation of these individuals' privacy and human rights. They were abusive, deceitful, manipulative, and wrong. The MPS apologizes unreservedly to the individuals whose lives have been and continue to be affected. Further, as the MPS said in its preliminary closing remarks at the conclusion to T2, sexual relationships and the poor management facilitated them were unacceptable by the standards of any time and amounted to serious.
What is the question?
Do you align yourself with that apology?
No, I don't. I think that's a self-serving, slightly cowardly response by the Met to avoid responsibility for...
We're now on the Tuesday morning. It started off with Barr asking Boyling about the relationship with Monica. It gets more gross, I'm afraid. He downplays quite heavily. He tries to pretend it's a very short relationship. She's very clear that it was at least 6 months. He claims, we kind of slept together 10 times at most. He said that she was having sex with 2 other men, something that she denies. He keeps referring to this repeatedly, that she was a free spirit. He claimed that sexual gratification probably wouldn't be a primary motivating force. It wouldn't have done any harm to his cover to deceive Monica into the sexual relationship. He claimed there was only one occasion where Monica formed the basis for his reporting, something which is at odds with the evidence that we've seen. He said it wasn't an intense relationship for him, and it wasn't for her either. When he's told that she says it was, he said that's the first that he's heard of it. He didn't listen to what Monica said when she gave evidence recently, and it didn't appear like he listened to her when they were in a relationship either. Some of the things that she felt were painful about the relationship, things that he did, were put to him. He laughed at them, said no, he doesn't remember it. He denied mocking her whilst mocking her. It was gross. It was unpleasant. But he uttered the classic line, I never thought I would be in this position, so I can't answer, when it came to talking about his activity. He kept naming people. During this period, a lot of this stuff wasn't broadcast because he kept naming people who were not in the public domain. These were people who he claimed Monica was sleeping with. He kept naming them. He was told not to. He kept doing it. He said he didn't tell his managers about it because if he did, they'd have to have done something. Barr points out it was because it was wrong. Boyling then got in an argument with Barr about whether it was morally wrong. He says it was wrong because he's now found out that it caused a distress. It was pointed out to him that it was morally wrong because he was deceiving to us who he was. He said he was deceiving everyone. So he rejects the idea that it was morally wrong and blames her for the relationship. He said it's for others to decide as it broke the professional code. But as Barr pointed out, that was already been decided, to which Boyling had another tantrum and said, without me being present, because yes, Jim Boyling decided not to turn up to his own disciplinary, and he was, in fact, sacked from the police. He claimed he's not the bad guy, and he's been treated as a defendant and started to sulk. He denied having sex with Monica again after the relationship ended. He was very angry about this. He suggested it would be unthinkable. This was the beginning of him having one of his many tantrums. He said that he's reporting on Monica. He was careful not to have any negative consequences for her. And then went, but you'll probably show me where I haven't. Like some sort of petulant child.
At the very end, when Mitting says goodbye, he informed everybody that Boyling did not appear voluntarily. He was compelled. And he makes various comments about feeling like a defendant, and he is here under duress. He does not want to be giving this evidence, and he has been coached. And there is this kind of flickering personality where you go between the petulance and the tantrums and the contempt and the attempts to look like he's being thoughtful and being helpful. I really did get a sense of this kind of flickering personality where he's trying to keep to his training, but it slips a lot.
He said that you tried to be fair when reporting on people you are having sex with. He claimed that the SDS withheld intelligence because they felt that the consequences would be unnecessarily severe on certain individuals. So he admitted that they didn't give intelligence to other forces who were trying to build cases on activists. First, he says that he would have withheld the information from his managers. Then he contradicted himself and said, no, he would discuss it with their managers and they would decide together not to share the intelligence any further. He said he was just very careful with his reporting. This seems incredibly serious to me.
It's obvious to us from everything that we've been reading and everything we've been seeing, but this is the first time that it's ever really been admitted. There was no pretense at impartiality or objective reporting of intelligence by the SDS. This was clearly ideological reporting. He says that his managers had ideological beliefs that would affect reporting on a campaign, like how they felt about a campaign.
I think the anti-genetics campaign, one where
they had sympathy with the anti-genetics campaign, so they wouldn't record that or pass it on. It's deeply biased political policing, personal preferences deciding whether or not intelligence would get passed on. Personal political beliefs being the deciding factor on how intelligence would be dealt with.
We just had another question. Was him being compelled connected with his sacking? Like if he was still a cop, might he have got away with not showing up? I'm not essentially the inquiry, like compelling officers to appear, is something that's always in their remit. Certainly, I can imagine them behaving very differently towards him because he has been sacked from the force.
We noticed at the end of a lot of these days of evidence that some witnesses Mitting thanks at the end of the day. Other witnesses he does not. I believe that when Mitting does not thank a witness, it is because he's had to compel them to be there and feels no need to be grateful for their appearance. I think he told us specifically at the end of Boyling's evidence because he did say how he accepted that it may have been difficult to give some of the evidence, even though you've been compelled to be here. So it was his kind of, I'm not thanking you comment that made it clear that he definitely had been compelled. But I think how Mitting treats the witness at the end does give you an idea.
There's definitely not an undertaking for the police witnesses. What does it actually mean to be compelled? They have to show unless they are outside the jurisdiction. So they can move to Scotland or they can move to Spain for a really long time because the inquiry is not short. But they're all compelled to show. Or they can claim mental illness, which is what we've seen from some of the officers.
Have your name withheld or to not have your face shown, special measures. But Jim Boyling is in a different situation because we've known his real name for a really long time. We've known his cover name for a really long time. And there was no way he could get anonymity.
Tuesday morning, he was in full tantrum mode by this point. he leaned very heavily on his lack of memory, all the stuff to do with Monica, much more so than he had on the previous day. It got to the point where, when it was pointed out he was making a snide comment about Monica, he claimed not to know what snide meant. He said that he'd made all the comments he needed to make and he wouldn't be saying anything more about it. He repeated he had a high opinion of Monica and got very angry with David Barr about the line of questionings. He was asked about Monica's feelings on the discovery that he was an undercover officer in 2011. He claims he didn't see any possibility of that arising, so he didn't think about it. He said there was only ever a slim risk of him being exposed, so he didn't have to think about Monica's feelings. He said it was very clear that his manager was aware that he was in a relationship. He wasn't making a secret of it. He would talk to fellow officers about it. When he was pushed on this, he declined to name people. He said that he told HN1, a cover named Matt Rayner, which was something we already knew. He says he daily desperately tried not to name any undercover officers. And then when he was pushed, he says that he can name Peter Francis as one officer that he told. And then he says that there was only some, he doesn't name any others, but were in the same field. He said none of them reacted to the fact he was having a sexual relationship with an activist. He says about half of them were having sexual relationships with activists. The way it was put to him about the fact that there was plenty of people in RTS having sexual relationships. So this idea that you had to be in a sexual relationship. He said, they'd all been in relationships with each other at some point.
They'd lived in the same squats.
Is it your evidence that you didn't tell your managers?
Yeah, I didn't tell my managers.
Was that because you knew it was wrong?
No, it was because I knew they wouldn't want me to their attention.
Because it was wrong.
The management could know about something without me bringing it to their attention. If I brought it to their attention formally, I'm putting them in a position where they would then have to take a position. I was aware that wasn't something that would be applauded.
And that's because the right answer is it was wrong. Morally, it was wrong in any way.
Yes.
What ways?
Because I'm not going to question anything that Monica's saying in her account now, and I think she's saying that it caused her distress. I would not have wished to cause her any distress.
It was morally wrong because you were deceiving her as to who you really were. It's not an answer to the question.
I think it is.
We were shown a report of his from May 97 about AGM with Shell. Boyling reported on it, but he didn't know if Shell were warned in advance or not. He was asked about the relationship the SDS had with private companies. And he said that though he wouldn't have had those conversations himself, he was aware that private companies had their own intelligence sources. And that intelligence was then passed on to the SDS so they could mark the homework of the private investigators that private companies were deploying.
I think this is massive. He appeared to believe that he was telling the inquiry that, no, of course, we wouldn't be passing intelligence on to private companies, but he says they would give us intelligence and we would mark reading their intelligence and telling them whether it was right or not, which is passing information to them. And yeah, this is something that so many officers have tried to avoid or deny. And he was asked which companies. He realized that he hadn't actually denied that they were passing information to companies. He started to close up around the topic. He admitted that they did do this with Shell. Then he made vague reference to financial companies in the City of London. I can't remember if he was asked about McDonald's, but we know because of evidence that came out in the McLibel trial that there was contact between police and McDonald's as a company. We haven't had any officer willing to admit to that or to provide any information about how that worked or who was responsible. I think Boyling's answers on this was clearest and most useful nuggets of information so far about that crossover between police spying and private companies and private corporate interests.
Hopefully in the managers section in the summer, we'll be getting into this.
It did make the whole story seem a bit incredible. And I think he was asked by McDonald's a little bit later on in the day, and he actually said, we'd heard about the private spies in London Greenpeace meetings from reading about it in Private Eye.
Yes.
I didn't even admit hearing about that from the SDS colleagues or anything.
If they got it from Private Eye, it would explain why it was such a joke.
Well,
Quite.
I find it incredible that Lambert wouldn't have mentioned it. They were such good mates.
So now we get into the deception of Ruth, the second woman Jim Boyling deceived into a sexual relationship. She'd been involved in activism since she was a child. He claimed that he got into a relationship with her because he liked her. But as she was so connected with Ukrainian streets, it didn't do his deployment any harm. He said he probably should have thought about the fact he was an undercover officer before embarking on a relationship with Ruth, but he was living in his persona full time, never mind the fact he was having daily meetings with his managers, men who deceive women into sex need to be understood more. That's what the problem is. He said his managers, if he'd have had any moral qualms to go take to his managers, they would have regarded it as absurd. He suggested that it was some sort of sexual advance that he was unable to resist. He says he told 104 about this sexual advance, and he was told to use his initiative. He talked about there being high maintenance and low maintenance undercover officers, and that he didn't want to be a high maintenance one. He was a low maintenance officer, so he didn't ask for help or advice from his managers.
The number of red flags around cultures of toxic masculinity in the Metropolitan Police. It's just bing, bing. The idea, first of all, we have the way that Boyling blames the women. We've heard him blaming his wife. We've heard him blaming Monica. We've heard him blaming Ruth. And we've heard all sorts of stuff that I'm not going to mention. This idea that he needs to be better understood, and somehow this is a problem created by the women, and something that, because of his ideas of what a young man ought to behave, means that he has no choice in how he responds to this. And this idea that he couldn't take any of these problems to his managers because that would make him look weak. This idea of high maintenance and low maintenance officers, it's so messed up. And I think a really key thing is we hear these attitudes expressed over and over again by these officers, and they're expressed unquestioningly. How many alarm bells are going off to the people listening? I think that he feels that he ought to be a sympathetic character in this.
He didn't discuss the relationship with him and disguised her feelings. He says the relationship worked for him at the time. In fact, it worked for both of us. But when it became too emotionally intense for her, he tried to stop it. He said the relationship with Ruth was public. He met her brother, her mother, and their friends. He denied ever going on holiday with her, and then said they would go to Actions together on the way back, maybe stop off for a few days of social time together. But that's not a holiday, according to Boyling. He was asked about whether there was any feelings of love within the relationship. He denied there was any depth of feeling. Then he claimed it was a philosophical question, and he wasn't there for that. He claimed that Ruth didn't give him any private information about her activist friends. He claimed not to remember anything she told him about that. And he only once used his connection with her to benefit his reporting.
HN 104 is another of the spy cops, not one of the managers. That's Carl O'Leary, as he was known at the time. He was told by the managers to use this initiative, but at the same time, Boyling's claiming that the other spy cops who had relationships were treated more sympathetically than he was. But it wasn't Carl O'Leary that told him to use this initiative.
The relationship with Ruth ended. He seems angry about this, disputed her version of events, and then says, I don't dispute them, though. He talked about the fact that she had a fling with another activist, which he seems offended by. It was pointed out to him that she feels repulsed by him now. He seemed angry about that.
When she found out that you were an undercover police officer in January 2011, her evidence is that she was hurt and angry. And more recently, she's felt repulsed. Those feelings are unsurprising. Mr. Boyling, do you accept conduct was repulsive?
No, I don't think so.
Because you deceived her.
Yes.
You betrayed her trust.
I didn't realise that was a question, sorry.
You betrayed her trust?
Question mark.
Yes.
I guess so, within the context of the situation in which I found myself.
Do you want to accept an undercover police officer into a sexual relationship with somebody doesn't emotions?
No, it does manipulate their emotions, but I think being an undercover police officer manipulates people.
And you manipulated her sex?
No, I don't think I manipulated her.
It's an extension, isn't it? If you are not who you say you are, and you are having sex with her, you are manipulating her sex.
Incredibly gross. After we got through the Ruth questioning, there was a lot of questions about June the 18th, 1999, the Carnival Against Capitalism. It was a very significant event in activist terms. Jim Boyling describes himself as a key organizer. As we heard from GRD and the previous week, he was the person who coordinated the simulated crashing of cars at either ends of the block road in order to have the street party. He says that his managers were fully aware of his role. He didn't seek permission to obstruct the highway. So it was such a minor issue obstructing the highway that it wasn't even considered by the SDS at any point. We were shown some reports in the lead up. He claims that on top of the very detailed reporting that does exist, he claims there's a great deal more intelligence about the event that he provided that was not being shown, doesn't appear to have been presented. He talked about the fact that he normally would just give oral briefings to his handler, but on June the 18th, he wrote it down because there was so much detail and it was so important. They had to make sure it was all properly reported. He spent £13,000 as treasurer of Reclaim the Streets as part of the planning for JAT. He bought the cars and hired all the other equipment. He became the treasurer because he worked by consensus for spending the money, as everybody in the group had to. He talked about one of RTS being wealthy and donated, and the fact that other money had been raised from the likes of Chumbawamba. He said he was always looking for ways for activists to be given an opportunity to snatch a draw. This was part of this whole thing about claiming that the SDS weren't in the business of destroying Reclaim the Streets. That in fact, they wanted them to be able to carry on what they were doing, but as long as they had coverage, as long as there was full coverage of it, then as far as the SDS were concerned, then these groups were going to be allowed to flourish.
I find it amusing that he uses that term in the context of June the 18th, because anybody who was at June the 18th came away feeling we snatched a draw there, didn't we? June the 18th was a massive win in the sense that it changed the political dialogue. Anti-capitalism became something that wasn't an echo to the Cold War and communism. It was when anti-capitalism as a political position wasn't about communism. It was about the wrongs of what was happening, became part of the popular political discourse and the whole anti-globalization. I think one of the things that you really need to think about in terms of Boyling's role in Reclaim the Streets is that after the event, the Home Secretary of the time went into Parliament and said, how was this allowed to happen? This was allowed to happen because the organisers of this event do not talk to the police. We had no idea what was going to happen. There was no way of knowing what they were going to do. And that is absolute nonsense. The organisers of this event included the police. Jim Boyling was inside organising this event. The police knew exactly what was going to happen. There are written reports from weeks before the event describe what happened on the day. This is how people are going to be moved there. They knew everything. And so the key point is contempt for uniform, and the SDS knew what was going to happen, but it appears that they chose not to tell the City of London Police, who were responsible for policing on the day. And I think there needs to be a lot more questions asked about that and about why that happened.
The withholding of the intelligence from the Met Police to the City of London Police. There's a second example of this turf war within policing. The Met Police were more concerned with getting primacy of public order in the City of London than preventing any particular disorder on the day. This was explored further later on, but essentially the upshot appears to be that they claim that the City of London turned down the intelligence. It seems much more likely that the Met were withholding evidence. They were surrounding the city with riot police ready to go in. There was 2 gold commands on the day, one from the city, one from the Met Police. Just for people who don't really understand that the Metropolitan Police are the whole of London, yet the city, the financial district in the centre, has its own separate police force. This is considered an anachronism in the eyes of the Met. And there's the desire to usurp the role they ostensibly take in the city. This is very significant because it shows that there is nothing about preventing public disorder in terms of the SDS role on the day of June the 18th.
I think that's a really key point because we've had this point from the Metropolitan Police and from the SDS about the justification for what they were doing. And we keep hearing this issue of public order. And we've looked at some of the major public order events that have happened over the course of the years that the SDS have been involved. And there are some like the Brixton riots of 1981, where the SDS admit that their spying and the groups that they were spying on were completely irrelevant. This was a spontaneous outburst of popular unrest. And whilst the police tried to blame the Brixton riots on some of the local anarchist groups that the police were spying on, it really didn't have very much to do with them at all. We've seen a lot of discussion around Welling. The evidence that we've seen makes it quite clear that the intelligence was used by the police to raise antagonism with the crowd on the day. J18 is one of the very few occasions where we can say that the SDS did have someone on the inside gathering the intelligence, knowing what was going to happen on an event that could have been said to have been a significant public order incident, and nothing was done about it. Nothing was done to prevent that. Use that intelligence in order to prevent any kind of public order incident on the day. In fact, quite the contrary. If you didn't stop that, what were you doing? What was the point? And it blows the whole public order claim out of the water. When we came into this and I became part of the Reclaim the Streets core participant group, it was like there was significant public order. We are going to have to think about the question of this justification of having to spy on groups that were creating public disorder. But then we saw the evidence, and it was like they could have prevented that public disorder. They didn't even take their own advice that they had.
Let it all go ahead because it was in the city.
Yeah, June the 18th. The fact that they knew that the demonstration would be going to the Futures Exchange, they could have protected the Futures Exchange. What kicked off the public disorder on June the 18th was the provocation of City of London workers, the traders at the Futures Exchange, standing on the balcony, throwing photocopied £50 notes down over the crowd and shouting, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." People went through the doors of the Futures Exchange and went up the escalators. That's provoked the riot police to come down and try to clear the area and get people away. The fact that we were going to this Futures Exchange was something that the police knew weeks before the event. They had police outside the Bank of England protecting the Bank of England. They did not have police outside the Futures Exchange protecting the Futures Exchange, and they allowed that confrontation to go ahead.
Yeah.
This goes all the way through Jim Boyling's deployment, right from his very first year undercover. He reported on the Watley Quarry action in Somerset in November. It ended up costing, I think, £250,000. 60 people got arrested for aggravated trespass. He claimed not to have any memory at all of this, but he did admit that the local police in Somerset were caught completely unexpected by this demonstration. He knew about it in advance. He claims now not to remember this event at all. And no, there was only one protest like that ever at Watley Quarry that caused that much damage. And everyone else who was there remembers it very clearly.
Here's this video.
Did you influence the direction of the planning to make it more palatable to the police?
I would always be looking for a way in which I thought the activists would be given the opportunity to snatch a draw.
Can you explain what you mean?
It's not the intention of special branch to crush or oppose them. It is our intention to gain full sight of what they're doing, to provide accurate intelligence to form the basis for the policing plan. It's not our intention to arrest organisers, to prosecute organisers. It's simply our intention to gain full coverage over what they're doing. Once we've gained full coverage of what they're doing and we can see it all and we can provide a stream of reporting on, that's game over for us. We'll sit in that position indefinitely. We don't want to destroy them. Quite the opposite. We've put so much work into getting that access. The irony is we would want them to flourish.
Can that really be right?
Yeah.
If their events are leading to public disorder?
It was a cliche I was told about SDS when I was still in the back office. People notice that once SDS become heavily involved in groups, they tend to flourish.
I'm not buying that.
It's utter nonsense what Jim Boyling is saying, because what we see immediately after Reclaim the Street, after J18, which they have decided to go ahead for the greater glory, as he said, of Scotland Yard in their turf war with the City of London police, what you then see is a police conspiracy to undermine and harass and prevent RTS from being able to spread its message and get its ideas across. You actually see in 1997 when 3 people are arrested and 20,000 copies of a newspaper are seized by the police using SDS intelligence to find those newspapers before they can be distributed to commuters the day before the March for Social Justice. What you see immediately after J18 is Boyling himself in discussions with managers about raiding print shops to seize publicity material for the forthcoming May Day demonstrations, and lists of activists being drawn up for harassment by uniform. And you have comments from Special Branch talking about how Uniform are going to be delighted to be let off the leash by Special Branch and allowed to harass people. Coming at it from the other side, having lived through those final years of Reclaim the Streets and the harassment and the burnout and the energy that was sucked out of that group by the levels of overt policing and harassment we were experiencing, to find out that was being planned and plotted by undercover police on the inside, selecting the best people for that harassment to be directed at in order to undermine the group. But what it does show is that they were deciding, is it better for us for this group to go ahead? Is it better for us if this group's political actions are successful or not? And the cynicism of the deciding factor on whether a group was going to be targeted for harassment and undermined, or whether a group's actions were going to be allowed to go ahead, or whether information was going to be passed to the public order police in order to try and prevent that happening, was being made on the basis of the self-interest of a small group of political police inside Special Branch for the greater glory of their managers at Scotland Yard. Political implications of it, the evidence still hasn't been properly aired and made public by the inquiry, but I think it's going to take a lot of unpacking to look at what happened there.
We then did a lunch on Tuesday with very little pre-warning. We go into the hearing thinking we're going to be able to report on it, and it appears there is a blanket restriction order. We're given the impression that the next session of the hearing would be specifically about the matter, which is of material concern to a number of core participants whose privacy should be respected. There was an enormous amount of other stuff not covered by normal restriction orders, but now caught up in this blanket restriction order. I started off the afternoon thinking, well, this is fair enough. I wouldn't want this stuff coming out if I was implicated in it either, I understand. And then I just got increasingly frustrated as they went over numerous other topics. This is partly because of Barr's approach, which is to pivot, but I feel that the inquiry could have worked much better. I got the impression perhaps it was because they didn't trust Boyling to not blurt out something as they jumped between topics. Hopefully when a redacted transcript is published or an edited video is published, then people will get a sense of how difficult he was being through this whole process. So there's nothing we can report of the rest of the day of Tuesday or the morning of Wednesday. The next point we're able to report was from the afternoon session of the Wednesday. There were a couple of bits about his deployment before we got to Rule 10s, stuff about the way the reporting meetings in this safe house were operated, and questions about the other areas of deployment his fellow officers were deployed at the same time as him were reporting on. This led to this question about Stephen Lawrence.
In February 1997, the verdict in the Stephen Lawrence inquest was announced. Something came up in conversation in the SDS.
Never, to my knowledge.
Are you sure about that?
I'm sure about it.
Are you able to help us with the reaction within the SDS to the Stephen Lawrence inquest?
None whatsoever that I remember. I don't think it impinged upon us at all.
Was there ever any talk of Stephen's death being exploited by the far left?
No.
In July 1997, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was announced.
None whatsoever.
Are you sure nothing was said about it?
I don't remember anybody saying anything at the meeting about it or in my presence about it. I think everybody knew that whole area would have been particularly toxic. I wasn't aware of any involvement for police. I don't recall it ever coming up at the meeting. Certainly not in the main meeting. It might have come up at a separate meeting for the people working on the left wing, but I wouldn't have been at that meeting.
In June 1998, 5 suspects appeared in front of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And there was disorder outside, which we understand HN81 was present. Was that an occasion which was talked about anyway at SDS meetings?
Never in my presence.
Did anybody express any view about the event?
The same answer.
In February 1999, the Macpherson report was published with a finding. Not only was the murder investigation deeply flawed, but there was also institutional racism. What was your reaction to the Macpherson report?
I didn't have a reaction to the Macpherson report.
None whatsoever.
No.
Despite it being a toxic subject.
I've never had any involvement in Lawrence or Macpherson or any tasking of it, nor have I discussed it. It's not an area I've ever impinged upon it.
That's not what I'm asking.
It answers your questions. I was trying to help you.
I'm asking whether you had an opinion?
No,
Did any of your colleagues express any opinion?
no, not in my presence. Same answer.
What was the opinion of your managers, then HN58 and HN53?
Same answer.
Did they say anything about this infiltrated report?
Same answer.
The inquiry has had evidence from some of your former colleagues that these questions were the subject of discussion and
Not by me.
you
I
certainly.
would have remembered that.
Why would you have remembered if it didn't matter very much?
From the policing point of view, it's a big subject. I find it quite strange that this has become a big thing. I genuinely was not aware of it. It was never discussed in my presence. I don't remember being aware that anybody was involved in it. I can't be more comprehensive in my answer.
Incredibly unconvincing, I thought. He was also asked about the sexual relationship. Some of the other undercover officers who he was deployed at the same time as, most notably Mark Jenner. He said that, he was aware of all of it, that they discussed it. He doesn't know if it was widely known. He didn't see it being his place to tell SDS officers not to have sex with activists. He said it didn't bother him meeting the wife of Mark Jenner whilst Jenner was in a relationship with Alison at the Christmas party. He didn't see why that was an issue.
In relation to that clip and hearing Jenner named, it's worth remembering Jenner's reaction to similar questions, because Jenner quite clearly had heard about the findings of institutional racism against the Metropolitan Police. He quite clearly had discussed the implications and what the commissioner was saying about it and the significance of the Lawrence inquiry to the Metropolitan Police. The idea that Boyling doesn't really understand why this is even part of the conversation is utterly disingenuous. Jenner's response was absolute fury at the betrayal of the commissioner, who had accepted the idea that there was institutional racism, and a point-blank refusal to engage with any of this. And I think it's worth remembering that in the aftermath of the Macpherson inquiry, race relations training for police officers became mandatory. Yet we see no evidence at all that anyone from the SDS ever actually did that. It's a sign of their exceptionalism. I think Boyling's answers there are extremely irritating and extremely disingenuous. We've seen Jenner talking about it, that these things were live issues for everybody in the police at the time, but also for the SDS.
Nothing believable at all in any of his answers. And it's petulant at the same time. It's pathetic. He was then asked about the trips to Amsterdam and to Las Vegas. He claimed that none of them used any sex workers on either trip. He admitted that only himself and Jenner smoked cannabis in Amsterdam. No other SDS officer did. Contradicts what Jenner says. He said that Trevor Morris didn't smoke, but everybody else did. We said earlier about the apology and the attitudes towards women. He talks about being bitter and that he was demonized by the job that he did. The responsibility for deceitful sexual relationships lies with a combination of people. He didn't include himself in this combination. He was asked about his psychometric profiling from the start of his deployment. He said that over the last 20 years, his judgment has been unsound. He clearly never spoke to any of the other undercover officers about what was being said at the inquiry, but he had spoken to them more on to say at the inquiry in general. He said it was mostly about mental health. He was asked to name them. He didn't want to do so. He'd be pushed on this. He then wrote it down, admitting he had to intervene to say, yes, it is important. Then we had the Rule 10 questions. So there was ones about the way in which the SDS and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit coexisted in the field. He then being told about an MPO-IU officer. He said that he knew one was turning to a London Greenpeace meeting he was at. That was Rob Richardson. He said he wasn't told who it would be, but it was obvious immediately to his trained eye who it was. He said that the SDS viewed the MPO-IU as rivals. Another examples of this internal turf war. There were no proper meetings between the SDS and the MPO-IU about upcoming demonstrations. He said there was bad feeling between the SDS and the Covert Functions Unit, which was the main undercover unit for the Met that ran criminal undercover investigations. It was put to him that Rosa's position was that if she had known right at the start that he was an undercover officer, she would have never had sex with him. Once she did know that they got back together, they got married and had 2 children. He doesn't want to undermine his ex-wife, and he's sorry if that's not what people want to hear. So he got into an open match with the public gallery, shouting at the public gallery. He was asked about the conversation he had with Bob Lambert about Rosa. He said he got no encouragement or discouragement from Lambert. He talked about how kind and supportive Bob Lambert was.
He said that when he first met her, she was working as a waitress in a vegan cafe. Rosa said, no, I've never worked as a waitress. That's rubbish. This is somebody he went on to marry and lived with for years. He never managed to work out in all of that time that she was never actually working as a waitress.
I mean, this is just another example that we see over and over again from these officers of seeking to minimize the length of time of the relationship. They seek to say that the women came onto them, that it was their choice, and that these officers who knew the full reality of the situation and essentially had all the power and access to files about the women that they were deceiving and emotionally manipulating, constantly claim that, because this is going to come up with me as well, made the first moves, made the choices, and these poor men simply had no choice but to go along with it. There is this key point about undercover officers deceiving women into relationships, which is they try to make out that the women that they deceived were not significant to their operations, were not part of the movements that they were spying on. This was in no way a tactic either to improve their legend or to gain access or to gain information. There's this idea over and over again from Jim Boyling about these were genuine relationships with genuine feelings that happened in this unfortunate context of other stuff that was going on. It had nothing to do with their deployments. And this claim, I was there at the time. I knew Rosa. She was part of the Reclaim the Streets milieu. She'd been involved in a lot of the activist stuff that was happening around that time. It's utter nonsense. Yeah, it's really important to say that Rosa has not actually had the opportunity yet to give evidence. I hope that we will be hearing from her in the future.
The inquiry said that in June, there will be space for her to give evidence. That's been indicated to her. Whether that will actually go ahead, we're not sure. Will we wait and see?
I think it's really important to say that don't take anything that he says at face value until we've heard her evidence.
That was the end of the evidence. I had to go back for a private meeting, disciplinary meeting about my report on the restriction orders that I broke. As it turned out, I am not to be blamed, which is the big takeaway from that. But there's now been another statement issued to everybody who attends the hearings about the importance of respecting reporting restriction orders, which I'm sure we will all take to heart.
I saw the email saying that there was going to be one.
A message direct to Victoria O'Brien of the public inquiry, reminding people that restriction orders must be obeyed to the letter and that there will be something about this put on the inquiry website. I haven't seen it. I certainly haven't been alerted to it. That there will be a single point of contact. Queries about this with no information about what that single point of contact is. It was a shocking email and provided no clarity at all about what the restriction orders actually refer to, making it preposterously difficult to report on this inquiry. And that is a ridiculous approach to be taking to something that, of course, it is important to protect people's privacy. Everybody on this call would respect if we were in a position to understand what things are supposed to be restricted and what are not. But telling people anything that was mentioned in a particular time frame and then not providing any information about what was inside or outside of that time frame is insane.
One thing that did crop up early on is where he was emphasizing all the time I was there, it was not an all-white unit. I think that opens the door to all sorts of things about which other officers are involved in the unit that haven't been declared, some perhaps TNs, because Trevor Morris was on his way out as Boyling was on his way in. And Trevor Morris is the only black officer that we're aware of that was working undercover in SDS during that time period. And that also speaks to when he was later discussing how within SDS there was no discussion, no interest in the Stephen Lawrence developments, either at the time of the inquest or at the time of the announcement of the inquiry. He's emphasizing that it's not just a white lads club because he's implying there are black officers, but then we have no sight of any additional officers apart from Morris. It seems unlikely there are any black officers covering the far right at that time. But yeah, that kind of a hint of a kernel of interest there. And Boyling seemed to be driving a little bit of a wedge into the line of there being no prior discussion of sexual relationships. That's a door that's going to be leaned on a lot more as we go through into the next few witnesses. Very interesting, quite disturbing. You certainly feel uncomfortable if you had to be in the same room as him. But I think there's some valuable insights that were revealed, more from what he wasn't saying or the way he was saying things than the actual substance of his evidence, written or oral. But perhaps the most interesting thing is how he was contradicting himself in his oral testimony with so much of what he put in his written testimony. So minimizing the lengths of relationships, yet that doesn't correlate with the specific dates he's putting on the start and the end of relationships. The relationship with Monica, he dates it April to October 97. That's 6 months. He's going to minimize it. Very casual. Maybe a few times we had a sexual relationship. And then the relationship with Ruth from November 97 to August 99. That's a long relationship. And yet that's the area he has been thinnest on providing any direct evidence in his written or oral testimony about how that might relate to Ruth.
Something else he hinted at about there being more female officers in unit when he was in it, who obviously we don't know about, so let's assume they've been given anonymity. But there's one thing I wanted the inquiry to ask him more about, which is he claimed that other female SDS officers had used an excuse so they didn't have to get into relationships with the activists they were involved with. And the excuse they used was that they'd had previous traumatic relationship experiences. But we don't know anything. Like, how did he even know that's the excuse they used if nobody in the unit ever discussed these relationships or the tactics and techniques? And who were these women and what movements were they in? We have no idea. That's stuff we have probably never find out about.
Testimony of Jim Boyling was cut short on 3 days instead of 4. The Rule 10 questions, you talked about them fizzling out, but our understanding is that he was told to finish. It's an incredibly frustrating process. And I was given the opportunity to suggest specific questions, and I had 3 or 4 pages and was told to cut it down to 2 or 3 questions, of which one got asked really badly. It's such a frustrating process, leaving so many unanswered questions when he steps down, and he's not come as far as where he might come back for questions from Rosa. But basically, those questions are now going to remain unanswered, or even unasked, more importantly.
Please follow the hearings as they happen. You just follow the hashtag SpyCops on whatever platform you prefer. I do live updates on Twitter during the hearings. The podcast series, SpyCops Info Podcast, comes out fairly regularly. You can find links to all these things and a great deal more at spycops.info. Thanks for joining.